part of our fundamental values. And so it guides all aspects of the life of our communities. And we had a really amazing presentation yesterday from Terry Lynn Brandt. It was not live streamed, it was not shared. For those that were participants, one of the most profound things that she said in her presentation yesterday was that the problem is that the environment is serving our economy in the current structure, but our economies need to be serving our environment. It should be the opposite. We need to be flipping the script onto its head. And that's super important when we think about Indigenous economics, because we are talking about economies that are built off of reciprocity. And I'd like to share with you also, before we move into the day, I'll put it in the chat, but there is a great essay by Robin Wall Kimmerer called The Serviceberry, An Economy of Abundance. And in the current Western economic paradigms, we are talking about economies that are based on scarcity, about commodification, and about the accumulation of wealth, rather than an economy of sharing and reciprocity. And I'll just read one last a quote from, or a blurb from from the section of Robin Wall Kimmerer's essay, The Serviceberry, which I will put in the chat right now before I do this. Hold on one second. There we go. I just think it's such a beautiful way to start the day to think about Indigenous economics. So this is from Robin Wall Kimmerer, An Economy of Abundance, the Serviceberry essay, which is available online in the link. Gratitude and reciprocity are the currency of a gift economy, and they have the remarkable property of multiplying with every exchange, their energy concentrating as they pass from hand to hand, a truly renewable resource. I accept the gift from the bush and then spread that gift with a dish of berries to my neighbor, who makes a pie to share with his friend, who feels so wealthy in food and friendship that they volunteer at the food pantry. You know how it goes. When we think about these things of revaluing life at the center of our economies, we can shift our way of thinking. And this is the value systems that exists in many Indigenous communities globally. And it's being threatened by the forced participation into Western ideological predatory capitalist models. So with that, we're going to dive into some really great conversations and presentations today. I'm so excited for Deborah McGregor, who will be coming up next. And we'll have JC Chiblo. She'll be introducing Deborah as we go on. So excited. If you need any more information on how to register for the working groups, please contact us at research at Indigenous Climate Action, and we'll move forward with that. So thank you, and I'll pass it off to JC. Thank you so much, Marcicho.
Thanks, Ariel, and thank you, Lindsay, again for that wonderful opening. It's always so great to start in a good way. So hello, everyone. Minande Beneshi Quendish to Kaz Gitganzi B Donjaba Gigo and Dodem Anishnabe Kwenda Port Moody Megwandinda. So hello, I'm JC Chiblo. I'm going to be introducing our next speaker. I've been lucky to know our next speaker for the last, I don't know, like 5 or 6 years, and she never ceases to amaze me. So we're in for a real treat right now. I'm very excited about this. So our next speaker is Dr. Deborah McGregor, also known as Deb. She is an Anishinaabe associate professor, cross-appointed at Osgoode Hall Law School and the Faculty of Environmental Studies and Urban Change at York University. She's also the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice. She also has focused her research on Indigenous knowledge systems and their various applications in diverse contexts, including environmental and water governance, environmental justice, health and environment, climate change, and Indigenous legal traditions, just to name a few. There's much more that she does, and I definitely recommend Googling her and seeing all of her wonderful outputs that she makes. She also remains actively involved in a variety of Indigenous communities, serving as both an advisor and continuing to engage in community-based research and initiatives. She has also been at the forefront of Indigenous environmental justice and Indigenous research theory and practice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Deborah McGregor, so weird to call you that, Deb, to share her keynote address with us to kick off the first day. And I'll pass it over to you, Deb.
Secrets, JC, and And you guys for having me. It's been, I look at the agenda and it's pretty amazing. Like I think it's the transformation that, an inspiration for transformation that I think many have been seeking at many different levels and scales. Like we see this internationally, but I don't think folks necessarily know what that looks like. And really appreciate Ariel's summary of the day before. So that's fantastic. And again, Lindsay, for that opening, it's so amazing to hear a young person speak the language and open in a good way. Like to me, that's an excellent place to start. So I will share a PowerPoint, but I did want to, I feel like I should qualify my thinking around this, because it was hard to wrap my head around the idea of Indigenous economies. Just as Ariel pointed out, because almost as soon as you hear, or for me, I hear economies, because this is all in English, of course, this is why language is so important. It almost automatically sort of makes my body kind of tense up, because I kind of associate it with the global economic order, that then plays out in everybody's at the local level in people's lives, as being kind of, as she said, it's not serving environment, but also not serving people or well-being for the planet at all. So it kind of it kind of makes me cringe. But then I always remember that if we start from our own place, if we start from our own traditions, our own worldview, our own understanding of our relationship in the world, it can shed a different light on this whole idea, so it doesn't become a cringeworthy moment to be able to say Indigenous economies, and that doesn't make anybody kind of feel sick. so hopefully I'm able to do that. And I want to reflect on partly just experiences that I've had where it's come up, and sort of some of the kind of strange ideas that I see coming forward that are that seem to be trying to get it, seem to be trying to understand this connection to the natural world or environment, but in ways that are likely just kind of a tweaking of the system that we know is failing everyone and not working very well. So hopefully I'm able to do that. And in this narrative that I have going, in these little stories that I want to tell. So the first task, of course, is to be able to share a screen, and the appropriate screen at that. Oops, not sure what you're seeing, but hopefully I didn't give people a headache doing that. Okay. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay. So can people see that? JC, could you just give me the thumbs up, because you're on my screen, just to make sure that everyone can see this? Okay, good. All right. And once this is up, you'll have to manage my time, because then I don't see the time anymore. So I want to be respectful of people's time in this. So Indigenous economy, spirit, and the land. So I wanted to focus on this for a number of reasons. Partly, I was inspired for, and I use this actually in my teaching, the Gitson Wet'suwet'en piece that they wrote, their opening statement, way back in the 1990s, when they were putting their sovereignty claim forward, and it was called Spirit in the Land. And one of the things that they really had to do was try to explain their worldview, relationship to the land, what their laws were, where the authority came from, to people who knew nothing about Indigenous people. And one of the important points that they tried to bring across in these proceedings was that we didn't divide up the world into these kind of silos that we find ourselves in. They didn't say, okay, this is, Gitsan or Wet'suwet'en spiritual life, this is our social life, this is our cultural life, this is our legal life, this is our economic life. It was all kind of embedded from a holistic point of view. It was a way of life. So these kind of external kind of silos can be problematic sometimes, because they can be pit against one another. And we see that a lot. We see environment and economy often coming up against each other as concepts and ideas because they're seen as separate. They're seen as separate, whereas at one time they were whole. And so in this slide, I just wanted to convey that that was our history. That's what we did. Like I should have probably called my mom this morning and said, do we even have a word for economy in the Anishinaabe language? Because we were here for thousands of years and flourished, not just survived, but flourished in our lands and territories, waters, with our relatives, human and non-human, and other nations. And we had our own laws, governance systems, economic systems in place to enable us to be able to do that. So that's really most of the history here. So the idea of Indigenous economies already exists. It's already there in all its diversity, as Ariel pointed out. And part of our job, or maybe my job as a researcher and scholar, is to try to bring that forward and understood more. Because I kind of think that, well, actually, I don't kind of think, I know there's a real lack of imagination in broader society about what that might actually look like. And I say, well, we already did it. It's actually been here for thousands of years, and in many cases still exists. We don't have to kind of wonder about it or try to figure it out. It already was. And it was a very encompassing concept and way of life, and accounted for our ancestors and future generations and the spirit worlds. I think we're all pretty much aware that land is important. Anybody who's in this conference is going to know that. And you know, Yellowhead Institute came out with the land back, and now cash back. We know that land's important, but it's more than land. And what I've been told by so many elders and traditional knowledge holders, practitioners, keepers that I've worked with over decades, like they'll go, yes, but it always starts with spirit. Like that's the center. And land is an expression of that, or spirit is in the land itself. So for example, in this opening statement of the Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en that I was referring to, they talk about how their authority literally comes from the land itself, and describes it as a marriage between the people and the land. So it's central to Indigenous economies, but in very different ways than the dominant global, national, local, regional economic orders. So that's kind of what I wanted to convey here, is that we already have it. What we need to do is work towards bringing it forward in the work that we do. We just probably didn't call it economic systems. It was way of life is what we did. And so, you know, there is some wrapping of one's head around about what that might look like. So this image is just, again, to convey spirit and the land. So a lot of my work, I look at stories. So what do our stories tell us about how to be in the world? And in our stories, and I'll speak to Anishinaabe stories because those are the ones I know the best, often like are in times of great need and inspiration, like times that we're dealing with right now, often that would come from the spirit world through the natural world. So I have an image of this actually is from my family's maple bush. And and in those original stories about how maple syrup came to us, or the sap, comes from the spirit world and comes from the natural world. So it's not just like land, it's also spirit, because this is really emphasized, I find, by elders and others that I work with. One of my favorite stories, I consider the climate change stories, is Pipe and the Eagle. So again, it's Eagle who comes to our aid in this story, for love of future generations. So we rely so much on the spirit world, and I think we continue to do so, whether we acknowledge that or not. So that work needs to continue, because that's also what our stories tell us. In these stories as well, we also faced challenges. There were times when we didn't behave, and again, I'll speak about Anishinaabe people. We didn't always conduct ourselves properly in relation to the natural world and our relatives, and there was consequences for that in our stories. Like there's usually, you know, we have these gifts and then we don't behave as well as we could, and then there's a destruction that comes, or it gets avoided, because in the Pipe and Eagle story, it gets avoided through the work of the eagle and the natural world. And then there's a recreation, and we're given these instructions about how to be in the world in sustainable, harmonious, reciprocal kind of way. So again, a lot of that already exists, including when we're facing challenges. Because again, it's important not to romanticize, I find, because we did face challenges, and I do find it in the stories. And in that, I find inspiration, like what enabled us to be able to work through this huge challenge. So the spirit is in the land. So I'm not going to read this. Many of you are going to be already familiar with this. In terms of the planet, Mother Earth, not looking good. So despite even, you know, these efforts, and the Brundtland Report came out in the 1980s, and you know, all this acknowledgement over the last few decades in the broader world, things are actually getting worse. That's essentially what these are saying, unless we dramatically change the direction that we're going in. And they call for transformation. And this is why I think transformation is really important, and where I think Indigenous economies and Indigenous way of life becomes an inspiration, because there's just kind of a lack of imagination about what this could look like. People know there needs to be one, and it's not just tweaking the status quo by calling it green capitalism or the green economy. It's like literally there needs to be a transformation, and that's what a lot of these major reports call for. But having said that, we also, so this is one way of telling stories about the earth, but we also have our own ways of how we talk about these and how we tell these stories. I also wanted to mention this because it's important in terms of our worldview and ontology. Laurie Lambert is an Abenaki scholar. So it's not even part of Indigenous economies is going to be how we're going to also heal, like how we're actually going to assist the land and the earth to be able to heal from the trauma also, and the violence that it's also experienced. And so we're in this kind of situation now of recovery and healing. So that's really important in the work that we do. And this is acknowledged. And I think this needs to be part of an understanding or conception of what, or characteristic, because I'm reluctant to define what Indigenous economies is, but I can wrap my head around what I think conceptions could be based on our own knowledge and ways of thinking. And one aspect of it is how are we going to help heal and assist the earth itself in recovery, because it hasn't been going very well for the last 500 years. So why am I talking about this? I'm wearing my orange shirt. My mother is a residential school survivor. My grandmother went there, and this horrifying discovery in it's not even a discovery. People knew about the buried children there. But I'm in so many circles where colonialism is not acknowledged. That has to be acknowledged. There has to be an explicit decolonization effort in a lot of this work. And recently in Canada, reports have come out that have pointed to colonialism as being a factor in some of the work that we do. I'm trying to remember, Ariel, if it was a year or 2 years ago, we were at a CanC conference on a panel, and we were with Peter Victor, who is, former dean of the faculty that I'm also appointed in, and so he does environmental economics, and which is, trying to think about economics in a different way, like probably, overlap with Indigenous conceptions of it. And we did our thing, and I talked about why colonialism mattered in these conversations. And Ariel, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I remember her pulling out this poster on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And then I just remember, Peter kind of leaning over to me, and he goes, I haven't thought about, colonialism as part of environmental economics, because there's a justice component to it, right? And so it really hasn't been acknowledged, even as part of these other kind of conceptions and theories around how we need to kind of move in a different direction. So to his credit, he recognized that, and he goes, I need to know more about that. I go, yeah, in the Canadian context, where most of the lands are Indigenous peoples, either because we were here, that you need to account for that in any kind of theory or practice or what we're going to do about the future. And again, like these, there's plenty of evidence for this, but stunningly, in so many circles I find myself, people don't want to go there, and they don't see how it's relevant. They don't see how gender could be relevant to, to how Indigenous economies or climate solutions, or even understanding what the problem is. Like we define the problem differently, and therefore like our ideas for solutions are going to be different. So I always mention it, even though I know that you're a group who kind of already knows this. I find I need to say it, and I have to deal with people, you know, sitting at my table saying, I don't understand how that's relevant, you know. So I do feel I often need to mention it. I also wanted to say that there's voices that we often don't hear in these conversations. Youth and women, even within Indigenous communities, who tend to be excluded from a lot of these broader processes where these conversations take place. Even within our own communities, there's often voices that are not part of it. And I have to commend the work of Indigenous climate action and trying to ensure that we're hearing from different voices. And I try to do this in my own research. I have to suck it up sometimes. It may be sometimes I don't necessarily agree, but I'm like, okay, well, we need to hear it. We need to hear different voices who we don't often hear, but often the most severely impacted people from ecological, environmental, or climate crisis. So we need to pay attention to that. I just wanted to show this to you. This is a young woman that I'm working with from my community who did this painting. As part of healing and recognition of the 215 children. So again, all of this matters. People are like, I don't understand what this has to do with climate change, because this actually matters and impacts us now in the work that we do, in our work in the communities, or in my case, some of the research that I do is actually trying to assist with recovery and healing from this, from different perspectives. I really like her art and her inspiration, so I just thought I would share Nevada's piece with you. So one of the Ariel talked about this. How do you kind of turn these ideas upside down, or frame it from a different kind of perspective? And I thought about this a lot. I go on my long walks, like that's actually when I think the best is when I'm moving, and I think in thinking about it in terms of well-being. Like, how do we, like I was trying to think, what are those concepts around economies? And I have to do more work, to be honest, to explore this in a language context, to really like to move it further along, I think. And I think that we need, one of the ways I'm thinking about it is in terms of Indigenous well-being. Whatever it is that we're doing in this holistic way is going to support well-being. And this is very difficult to do because we're in a genocidal context, in a violent context, because people want to get control over lands and resources. So this is one of the main findings from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So this is a context we're trying to do our work in, and it's a challenge. I think about well-being as being very much tied to the land. So these are just images from my family sugar bush, really important in my family. I guess, again, this is one of those things where you can think of as being very spiritual, cultural, intergenerational, economic, all those kind of political governance, because it's tied to the moon system, which is governance and seasonal leadership, like all of those things into this thing that we do on the land. So it's very much tied to, again, these ideas of well-being, and it's hard work. These aren't easy to achieve. So assumptions, so these are just some of the assumptions, again, many of you know about, you would have heard from your keynotes and likely discussed in your small groups, is that Indigenous peoples have already endured these immense changes that other people are just starting to experience and wake up to. We've already been through that. So we've already been severely disrupted, as keynotes and Ariel talked about, but we've survived it. We already know how. And so there's things that we can contribute to these broader conversations, because literally we've had to face our annihilation through these genocidal policies, and we've come out the other end, and here we are having these conversations. So we also need to look at it from that point of view, where often I find in the world I'm in, academic world, Indigenous peoples are like hapless victims. We don't have any agency to solve our own problems, but we do. like we're like, I don't even think people fully grasp what we've been able to work through to be here today to kind of have the conversations that we do. I just wanted to just briefly kind of go through some of these, some Indigenous declarations. So this points to a little bit about what Ariel talked about in her opening remarks, is that Indigenous peoples have been critiquing that global economic, political, legal, whatever world order for quite some time. And we always had our own vision to put forward. So whatever these kind of solutions that were coming out, we always had our own perspective that would be coming through with this in some of the work that we do. And you know, part of what also we've been doing is resistance to these broader processes. And often I'm trying to protect we're in this position of this order, this understanding of the world and land and our relationship to it, that we've had to try to protect what's important to us and to resist these other forces, which I don't know if that's always fully understood, like particularly in media, but I think it's getting better. Before it's just like, oh, those protesters, without really kind of understanding like the deep commitments and the deep understanding about what it is that's actually happening and how it can offer like really a different vision for how to be in the world. So again, this is just another declaration. So again, pointing to like Indigenous peoples have been at the forefront of saying what's going on is hugely problematic, and offering, you know, what they, you know, a lot of Indigenous nations coming together to discuss what they see as being the problem and where they see us moving forward. And I respect the declarations quite a bit, because as Ariel pointed out, there is wide diversity of Indigenous peoples in Canada and around the world, and they come together and they agree on some things. And I'm like, great. I can't speak on behalf of all Indigenous people, but they came together and they figured some stuff out, and I'm going to respect that. So this is just you know, a bit of reflection in terms of just how there's starting to be a different kind of paradigm, maybe something that could lead a little bit to this transformation that's really required. The Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth, this recognition, this is like 10 plus years old now. But of course, this isn't new in Indigenous thinking at all, but they're just starting to be that. There's just starting to be a different sort of way of thinking about rights of nature, personhood. Like there's just different kind of ideas that are challenging the status quo way of thinking. Not exactly Indigenous thinking, but for sure there's places of commonality and where there could be interesting points of collaboration and working together, starting to happen, starting to kind of poke holes in this broader system that's so problematic for us. So teachers and ancestors. So I just wanted to, again, as I was wrapping my head around what Indigenous economies could be, because, you know, when I did the typical thing, I started to look it up, and a lot of what I was finding is, and I remember this from Winona LaDuke, and I don't remember what piece it was that she wrote it in. Maybe some of you out there might know what it is and put it in the chat for others. She just said, Indigenous, because I think her master's maybe is Indigenous Economic something or other, and she said that Indigenous peoples don't want a piece of the existing pie because it's kind of problematic. What we want is a different thing altogether, a different piece of the pie. And it made me think about how we think about these things in very different ways. And again, a lot of my inspiration comes from people who think in the language, who are language speakers. And these are two people who are hugely influential in terms of how I think. One is the late Josephine Mondawmin, and the late Robin Green. And I'll just relay a couple stories that they told me that hopefully will help you think about some of these ideas. So Robin Green, you know, was Anishinaabe from Northwestern Ontario, and he said we were, this was long ago, and we were sitting around debating sustainable development. What does that mean? And he. So this was after, you know, the Earth Summit in 1992, and everybody's all excited. This thing called sustainable development, it's the answer to what we're facing, trying to like not make it so binary between environment and in the economic world or economics. And so he's listening to us, like, try to debate this, because we had to come up with the Indigenous idea about what this could be, right? And he just said, and essentially that kind of the UN view of what sustainable development is how do we keep taking forever? Like basically, how do we kind of tweak the system so that we can keep taking, so future generations can be just as consumer and consumptive as we are, but maybe in a more green way or sustainable way, is essentially what it is. And because he thinks in the language, and he said to us, that's not how Anishinaabe think about that. The way we think about it is we don't get up every day trying to think about what we're going to take. We get up every day thinking about what we're going to give. What's our gift going to be to creation? What's our gift going to be to life? And I went, okay, that's a very different way of thinking about, the economy, or what our life's going to be in terms of our livelihood. Again, because he thinks in the language, he's not stuck on whatever the UN says about any of these concepts. Josephine Mondawmin, I remember she was giving a talk about some of her walks around the Great Lakes, and she was talking about fast, like some of the ceremonies that we have. And she says, certainly it's a sacrifice, but that's what people tend to focus on, the sacrifice and the hardship of a fast, of not eating or drinking for, periods of time, whatever that might be in our different traditions. And she just said, what it does is it gives the earth a break. We're not taking from the earth during that time. So it's giving the earth a break. And she said, if more of us do it, then there's less people constantly demanding and taking from the earth. So again, it's like challenging that concept of taking from the earth and taking more than we need. So again, like really thinking about these things in very different ways, and putting the earth as central, and what our work is to try to ensure that it flourishes. This is another concept from my father. So again, in the Sugar Bush, I focus on this a lot. So I come from a family of 9. My mom was a principal, so education was important. And at one point, my brothers, I have 5 brothers, they wanted to sort of do that. Actually, it was the students who told me it was like pipeline, where they put the pipes in the trees, and then it collects the sap and goes into some building, and I guess evaporates the sap or whatever. My dad was adamant, no, we're not doing that, because it would totally change the way that we relate to the trees and to the gifts that came from the spirit world to ensure our survival. Because the sap comes at a time of great food insecurity, because it's right at that time when it's very hard to move through the bush. The water is, the ice is dangerous to be on, so it's hard to fish. So this medicine water comes at a time when we really need it. And he said, because if you do that, then instead of receiving a gift from the trees, you start to take from the trees. And you can be very tempted to start taking more than you need. And so it's understood in terms of our relationship to the trees is that it's a gift. It's a gift to us. And our job is to understand how to receive that gift, not to figure out how to take and then figure out how to take more than we need. So anyway, so that was kiboshed, and we continue to still go to every tree, go to different trees every year, and basically take direction from the trees about what they can handle any particular year. So it's just different ways that we think about in terms of our relationship. The other point I wanted to make about this, because many of you know, I've had to deal with this my whole career. I have an environmental studies degree, and read it. Indigenous people were just too primitive. They just didn't have the technology. We just weren't smart enough to be able to exploit, and make money. We weren't like that. That was why we were able to live sustainably, is because we didn't have the technology. We couldn't figure it out. But to me, this is a case where we can, but we don't, because you cross that line. You cross that line between receiving a gift and taking. So we could, but we don't. And there's other instances of that I've read, where settlers would see the smoke houses, and they would be a certain size. Go, why don't you make 100 of those, and you can take way more fish? And they're like, why would we do that? Because you could, but you didn't, right? So we make these kind of decisions. We have these values and ethics and laws in place that guide how we would do this. So I think that work is really important for us to do, and it's already there. We just have to kind of understand it in these different, or employ it within these different contexts. Not sure how my time is there, JC. I turned my phone off so there wouldn't be some sort of crazy request. So I will try to finish up because I'm starting to think maybe I'm overdoing it. So I just wanted to give those examples where these ideas exist, and it's similar to what Ariel talked about, Robin Kimmerer, who I love her work, and we talked about that before. It isn't just about survival, it's about how do we enable flourish? Like how can we flourish? And how do we enable Earth to flourish? Like that's part of what our responsibilities are. And we had our values and systems, legal governance, everything, systems in place to enable that to happen. So how do we imagine a different future? So this is just a picture from a elders, or images from an elders youth gathering, actually organized by the youth who wanted to know more about language and traditional knowledge and for trying to understand climate change. And what I really like about it is they talk about love. I'll have to say that only in Indigenous context has that ever come up. Like it's just not a relevant concept in climate change discussions, climate solution discussions, or Indigenous economics discussions, but it is an Indigenous context. Do we love the earth? Do we love future generations? So it's important in terms of imagining what we would like and how we want to be in the world. Again, it's tied to our language and identity. So language is really important. I find that for my work, I don't really learn the coolest things from reading stuff. I mean, I do, I get inspiration from that, but even their work, like Robin and others, it comes from actually interacting with people in the communities who think in the language, who are practicing traditions. That's where I usually find the most inspiration. And I just go, whoa, like that, that's usually where I learn the most inspiration. And so that's why language and identity and those relationships are really important, because that's where a lot of our inspiration is going to come from. So, so this is just a bunch of text. I'll just go through. Basically, what I'm saying is we have our own ways of doing this, and we have for thousands of years. And so we have a foundation from which to talk about these things. I do believe that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Human Rights Framework is really important, like absolutely, but they don't encompass everything that's important to Indigenous people. They don't really account for our relatives in the non-human world in the same way that we do, in the way that we think. Pretty well, almost anything to do with the way we think and interact with the world always goes beyond the human dimension. We're always thinking about our outer relatives. We're always thinking about our ancestors and future generations. So some questions that we might ask in this: are we honoring our relationships with our ancestors? Like these are economic questions, I guess you could say, with our relatives and teachers, with each other. Are we doing justice to them? And what are our own codes of conduct that help us maintain these reciprocal and harmonious relations? How do we ensure our relatives live well, flourish? So living well isn't just for us, it's for all relations, or natural world or environment, however we want to conceptualize this. And what knowledge, laws, and conduct is required to do this. And we have, and this is in our stories, because we get a lot of our instruction from there. So again, future generations. This is my 2-year-old niece in the sugar bush. Can't start too early. I think the pail was bigger than she was. So again, loving the earth. Do we love future generations? Does our work show that? How will our work benefit them? And what kind of ancestor are we going to be? Because my ancestors did what they need to do so I could be here to talk to you today. How am I going to honor that in terms of whatever it is that we're going to be tackling in terms of our challenge? We're still here. So again, going back to some of my earlier points is, for sure, we've had devastating things happen to us in our communities. But we're still here, so we have a lot to offer these other these other contexts and these other views that can help other people as well. And finally, people are interested in that, but I do think it needs to occur on our terms a lot of the time, so we don't get our knowledge doesn't get exploited and extracted from us. It continues to serve our own communities. So I think we do have something. We do have something to say. And I'll end here. So this is, I just remember this story being told by Isaac Day from up around North Shore, probably closer to where JC's from. And he's a great storyteller. I don't do his story justice at all. So he talks about this. This is a painting by Norval Morse. So I like it because it shows all the connections between everything. But what he said is, we're all part of this story. We're all part of this grand unfolding of the earth. Like that's what's happening. Like there's this unfolding of the earth, constant change happening all the times. And we can decide who we're going to be in that story. In the Anishinaabe tradition, we have these concepts of the Wendigo, this insatiable monster beast that just takes way more than it needs. So it's in our stories. It's there for a reason. Or the path of Minonamazuin, a good life, living well with all of creation. We have a choice in how we want to be in this grand story of the earth because we're part of it. So I'm gonna leave you with that and open it up to discussion or questions. I'd love to hear from you because you would have done some amazing things yesterday, some amazing things for the rest of the day, and I really thank you for being patient and hearing what I have to say today. So Chimigwech, I will stop share. Thank you. Oh, that's so beautiful.
Yeah, I just want to point to, I think Deb is referring to the graphic recording that's happening in the corner there. I hope everyone can see it. It's just beautiful work. Again, if you have questions, you can type them in the Q&A. And for those on YouTube, you can just type them into the chat or into the discussion piece and we'll get to them when we do. So feel free to start asking and we'll get to the first question here. Deb, lots of comments I'm seeing in the chat. Some people were really enjoying seeing your 2-year-old niece working in the sugar bush with you. So cute. So this first question is from Tiffany. What would you recommend as teachings for us Indigenous land stewards to educate settlers on honorable harvests and how to not think of always money when foraging? I'll put it in the chat so you can read it.
Yeah, I think that's it's a great question because the fact of the matter is we're having to deal with other people on our lands, right? So one of the things that I would suggest, there was an interesting report, you could probably find it online. It was called Our Responsibility to Future Generations, published in 1992. And what I found interesting about it, and it still resonates with me, even, basically almost 3 decades later, is they said the basic source of the problem that we have, like the challenges that we're facing, perhaps even as Indigenous people and humanity, is because we have a separation from the natural world. We don't know how to be like in the natural world or collectively as humanity. We've forgotten what that is. So for settlers and a lot of the work that I do, I try to encourage people to start figuring out how to connect. And actually that elders youth gathering that I facilitated, that's what elders and youth, like despite being, intergenerational, like people think, oh, there's such different objectives in each generation. They both agreed on that. So youth wanted to reconnect. Elders said, we do have to continue that connection, and then help the earth heal, like help the earth recover and heal from what's happened to it. And that'll enable the people to heal and recover as well. So that would be something that I would recommend. People don't know how to do that. Like, how do you go outside and use your senses and try to understand? How do you, so that's actually really hard. Literally, JC is in my class. I make my class do it and they think I'm like crazy old lady making them do things. Because they have no idea how to even like connect and understand or feel, even with the basic 5 senses, let alone the other Indigenous senses that people talk about. So to me, it would be looking at it that way and trying to look at what's around you as even being a gift. And I'll say that's hard. Like the research I'm doing right now is around understanding climate change from an Anishinaabe context through the 13 moon system, like what's happening during each moon. Because in a lot of circles I'm in, they say, oh, well, we don't have a baseline. I'm like, well, yeah, we do. We actually know what's supposed to happen, right? During each moon. And I have to say that when I was out during the last full moon, I wanted to rename the flower moon the insect vicious biting moon, because that was kind of my experience. But then I started to realize you actually need to have the insects there. Like try to think of them as actually being a gift. It was kind of hard, in the moment, but they need to be there to pollinate. And because there's daytime and then nighttime pollinators, right? So So trying to like reorient your thinking to understanding these things that might be inconvenient to us as we're out there being is actually a gift for a reason. We may not know that reason, and that's for us to kind of figure out and unfold as time goes on. So that's some of the work we're doing. So I even kind of struggle with that myself because I was failing to appreciate that. And it took some thinking to kind of reorient that experience. And then I understood a lot better. I go, well, they're key pollinators, right? Like they have to do their work in order for life to continue, even if it's inconvenient for me in that moment to be swatting away at whatever. So that's something that I encourage, because I agree, like a big part of the problem is people don't know how to relate to the earth anymore in inappropriate ways. And if you get the chance, look at this 5-minute video that came from that gathering on the Chiefs of Ontario website. There's a wonderful insight from a young woman there named Jade Willoughby, and she said climate change is the earth telling us what's happening to her. So again, like, can we hear that? Do we understand that? And it's been doing it for some time, but we didn't kind of get it at first. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I really think that's important. And that's something that you can do and encourage other people to do. Sometimes you don't feel like you can affect, let's say, federal government policy or international policy, but that's something that we can do with the people around us. And I make people do it, I guess, because I can do it because I have the authority as a teacher, even if they think I'm like crazy old Indigenous woman making us do weird things outside. So.
That was a great activity. A lot of the students that was in my class for that actually really enjoyed it. She made us go out onto the land for like, I think it was an hour, just like halfway through the class, go out and check out the environment that we're in and really start to relate to it. And then we had to do a reflection. So if you are a teacher, it's a great activity, and it was really well received by all of my my other students, people. So this one's from Sherry. It's actually, I think, is a really great question. This goes back to the sustainable development idea. When you said we look at sustainable development differently from settler communities, the idea of taking versus giving, do you see a middle ground or how those two ways of knowing can exist together?
So that's a big question that a lot of folks are working on. I'm really trying to train my thinking to not be so binary, I guess you could say, to not be so like to look to see where we actually might be wanting the same thing, and actually where there's actually commonality in terms of how we think. So my other big field of study is Indigenous knowledge systems, and so a lot of folks I'm working with are wrapping their heads around that, and the way that we're thinking about how to bring different sort of ideas into a space without predetermining that it should be like how do you balance it out, because that's what they try to do. Like that's one of the core ideas of sustainable development. How do we balance environment, and where is there going to be the sacrifice zones and whatever else, right? Like what are we going to, so but to me, maybe we don't need to do that if we actually come to a common space of where we actually agree on things. So what's becoming kind of all the rage right now is this idea of ethical space. Willie Ermine wrote about this, and so it's now becoming actualized through Indigenous-led protected areas. I think it's going to be entertained in the whole idea of nature-based solutions, also that Ariel kind of talked about. That's also kind of becoming all the rage, this idea of ethical space, like, because there's also different knowledge systems, right? It isn't just Indigenous and Western. Like there's other kind of, even within Indigenous, there's a lot of multiple knowledge systems. Then we had our own ways of dealing with that. Like Anishinaabe had our ways of how we would deal with Haudenosaunee knowledge. And even within theirs, there's like 6 nations, right? So we had our own ways of dealing with multiple knowledge systems. So I think this idea of ethical space brings them together without saying, okay, JC and I have to somehow compromise and then come to some kind of balance, give something up to gain something in order to get some kind of outcome. It's more around trying to bring people into a space of recognizing that you're actually going to engage, and there's going to be negotiation, there's going to be discussion, there's going to be dialogue, probably mistakes made, go back to the drawing board, figure it out, right? And this is actually core to Indigenous law. There was a very deliberative sort of component to it. For that reason. And again, I also see this in a lot of our stories. So I guess my response is, it's very hard to to get away from the binary thinking. And I'm not going to say it's not useful. It's very helpful in order to wrap your head around concepts, but it doesn't really, I don't know if it's really going to advance our thinking, as opposed to trying to figure out where there's actually the spaces for where there could be the ethical engagement. So I know that's really abstract and conceptual, and a lot of folks like Danica Littlechild are trying to figure out what does that actually kind of look like, kind of on the ground, like how do we actually do it? And we have to kind of like do it now. But I would say that Indigenous peoples already had traditions for doing that. Like I think about the Dish at One Spoon Treaty. So I'm in that treaty territory area. We would have had to do that with the Haudenosaunee to figure out how we were going to be sustainable around a huge territory like the Great Lakes. And I don't think we went into that conversation of, or that negotiation, because it's a treaty, as from a binary way of thinking. I think we all agreed that we needed to sustain and support the land in order for us to be able to flourish as nations. So I don't have like the nice, neat answer to that. So apologies for that, because right now I'm in spaces where we're trying to wrap our heads around that very question, where we're trying to get away from like a very strict kind of binary way of thinking. Because that just creates kind of opposition and people wanting to take positions, and you're wanting people to just really be creative and have imagination and think about, transformative ways of thinking. So hopefully I'll know more next time we chat when I can work some of this out.
Yeah, thank you. It was a great question. Oh, I'm getting some feedback on your mic, but we have time for one more quick question. I do see that there was 2 here, so I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. But I found that this one's a nice like takeaway kind of question. So Nell says, thank you for that inspiring presentation, really highlighting taking only what you need. How do you inspire that in this insatiable market-driven economy? Stories are a great medium. What could be some other ways for those who may not be so great storytellers?
I think feel free to share the stories. I think they were very much intended to be shared broadly. They were shared publicly by the late Josephine Von Dahmen and Robin Green. They very much cared about future generation and life on the planet. I think it really does require transformative thinking. Like it requires, I'll just convey it in a couple of ways. So Rick Hill, he is a Tuscarora in Six Nations, works at a Grand River Polytech. So he came in, he was doing a presentation to Environment Canada, who you'd think would be very much an audience who would be kind of into what he was saying. And he said that because we've been so we consume way too much, right? And he just said, our generation, so I'd probably be part of his generation, has to be a generation where we actually kind of want future generations to not take so much, to not really kind of live that kind of consumptive kind of life that we're living, right? He goes, very scandalous thing to say. Everyone, like people around the table were just like, gosh, just like crazy. Like, what do you mean by that? We want things to get even better and more like, we're just sort of buying into this thing and trying to make that thing more insatiable thing, more sustainable. There was another space, and it was a conference organized by Dan Longboat called Igniting the Spirit. I think maybe JC was there with her mom at that one. And I was facilitating a workshop with Kyle White, who's a brilliant scholar, read his stuff, like really lovely person too. Like sometimes really smart people aren't necessarily nice. Well, he's like really nice and a brilliant person. And so we were facilitating this session, and I've been in these kind of spaces where people think like, hey, the way to not consume, and you can take this however you want, because I'm trying to work it out myself, is the solution is everyone should have an electric car. Everyone should have a Tesla. And literally, I remember sitting in a room and some old white guy in his suit said that. And I went, I don't like, to me, there's justice implications for Indigenous people who, in Ontario, have to bear the brunt of where the high level nuclear waste is going to be sited, because a lot of the energy comes from that, or hydroelectric dam, and like when you peel back the layers, there's going to be injustice to certain people, right? So, and I remember saying there, I think the whole idea is that part of the transformative thinking is we actually don't want a Tesla. Like that actually shouldn't be our objective, right? Like it's actually supposed to be, what's the alternative to that? Or how do you then like not have to rely so much on, wanting the Tesla or having to move around an electric car? And there's no doubt that's going to help right? But that's not the transformative kind of thinking that's required to actually change that reorientation and relationship with the earth. So again, it's a really good question, because I'm working through this a lot myself, trying to figure out, do I really kind of need that? Like, I'll tell you one thing about this pandemic. It turns out I have enough underwear. Really, I do. I know this is being recorded. Like, I didn't have to buy it. Like, there's just so many things I didn't have to buy. Like, it turns out I didn't really need that much food either, because my freezer is now half empty. So you realize that I actually don't need a lot of stuff. And so, like, really weird, but like it kind of forced you to think about, what do I actually really need that's essential? It turns out I don't need a lot of stuff, right? Okay, I'm sitting here like literally with all my books behind me, but I'm not going to buy anymore. So it's part of my job to be an academic. So anyway, so I think it's thinking about it in terms of different scale and really trying to be transformative in times of the thinking. So that's how I try to think, like, am I just like wanting to tweak the system for my convenience, or am I really going to like transform? Because it has to occur at so many different levels for that to actually happen. That's in our stories, but also in the big scientific reports, they say the same thing, but they don't have the vision, the imagination to see what that's supposed to look like. Whereas as Indigenous people, we're not that far removed really from our ancestors who lived in a holistic way to live well. We can find out what that is and figure out, and that's where young people, I think, in their cool imagination, ways of working technology, not hindered by being a middle-aged lady paying a mortgage or something, like they can think way creatively, right? And why we really need that kind of energy and creativity and innovation right now. So again, I feel like I failed you somehow by not having like a nice little answer to that, but a lot of the stuff I'm trying to work out myself. I know it needs to happen. And I guess the way I approach my research, I should have probably been upfront about this, is that I never try to believe I have the answer. I just want to ask the questions, and then I go and talk to these totally amazing, brilliant people all over in communities and help them try to help me answer those kind of questions, so I can come to these kind of spaces and share what I know. So hopefully I've at least done that. Yeah, so great questions, everyone. And the art's just so impressive. Like, I'm a terrible artist, so this is sort of like, wow, it's so cool. I'm distracted by it. So
I always appreciate your honesty, like talking. Yeah, I could listen to Deb talk all day, and I have, and it's always really inspiring and great. So I love the way that she's so real and down to earth, despite being, in those high level academic spaces and with government and all of those fun places that she is, and advocating for our rights. So thank you so much, Deb. It's always great to hear you talk. I really appreciated that whole thing, of course, as always. And I see there's a lot of really great things going on in the chat. A lot of gratefulness and thanks for your talk. So I think with that, we are going to pass it over to, I believe, Ariel to start our next session.
Shmiigwetch, everybody.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks, JC. Thanks so much, Masi Cho. I also feel a little bit like JC. Like, I could probably listen to Deb probably talk for a very long time. But this, we're looking to make sure that we're getting a large sort of spread of voices and ideas and thoughts, and we're moving into another theme for today. And so our theme for today is the ransom economy. And some might be thinking, well, what is this ransom economy? The ransom economy and the premise behind that, sorry, I just lost my notes. There we go, is really looking at, there's a scholar, Schuyler Williams, describes the idea of ransom economy as Indigenous lands and territories being held ransom. All the resource development is happening in Indigenous communities while systematically pushing away Indigenous economies, land, language, culture, who we are, is what wealth is for us. So like all the things that we sort of Deb talked about, and the idea of like what is valuable in our communities is systematically pushed away. And it's replaced by resources that are developed in our communities. So there is a movement to try and paint Indigenous peoples as holding Canada hostage right now. So we've seen this with the Wet'suwet'en, we've seen this with Land Back Lane, we've seen this with many sort of Indigenous resistance movements to resource extractive projects, whether that's Site C, Muskrat Falls, LNG, salmon farming. It's not just relegated to just fossil fuel extraction. We've seen like even Fairy Creek right now with the forest deforestation of old growth forests. We see Indigenous peoples standing up and pushing back against these extractive resources that have systematically pushed their original economies of land, language, and culture and who they are out of the way. And so we must seek to understand the ways in which the whole economy is structured around the theft of our lands, ransacking natural resources of our lands, or that our lands hold, and to contain the threat of Indigenous autonomy. And so, we're going to be hearing a couple of different speakers. One of our speakers was unable to make it today, Michael Mercurdy, and he's actually from my community, the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. And I see Larry has already joined us there, up in the videos of chats. But I'm going to try to do some of the justice of some of Mike's being missing here. So I'm going to play a little bit of a moderator as well as doing a little bit of a presentation, probably with Larry, to be honest, because we know each other very well and we worked within the context of working for both my First Nation and he worked with others, looking at impact benefit agreements and how they are essentially systematically trying to push our communities off to the side. But today we're going to start off, just wanted to give that change in the agenda that I will be participating a bit more. But to start off today, our first speaker, our first speaker we'll be hearing from today is Abi Odan Afolabi. Abi Duan is currently a doctoral fellow at the Alan Gray Center for Leadership Ethics at Rhodes University, South Africa. He's in his final year of his doctoral research in the Department of Philosophy at Rhodes University. He has his first degree in philosophy at Kunle, oh my goodness, as Ajasin University of Nigeria. And please, I apologize. I probably butchered that. I should have asked you how to pronounce that prior to. It's really important that we actually pronounce things properly. So I deeply apologize. His doctoral dissertation, he addressed issues relating to climate change ethics and the related questions about how cultural autonomy and cultural devastation can be treated in an overall conception of climate justice. He has presented papers on these issues at local and international conferences, and he's keenly interested in the conceptualization and resolution of peculiar development and global justice problems afflicting African societies and other vulnerable peoples around the world. His research interests are in the areas of climate change, ethics, global justice, and environmental politics. And again, I'd like us to remember that Indigenous peoples exist globally. And in the context, we have to think about original inhabitants and how economies threaten and push them out of the way for the types of resources and extractive projects they want. And with that, I'd like to welcome Abi Odun.
Yeah, Abiodun. Yeah, okay, that's fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much, Ariel, for that wonderful introduction. It's very wonderful to be a part of the discourse at this conference. And obviously, I've been treated with a lot of mind-blowing ideas about the indigenous people and their economy in so many ways. Starting with the presentation yesterday from Terilyn, it was quite insightful, and I'm pretty sure that the rest of the conference is going to present interesting thoughts that every participant could have so much to take away from. So I don't know, can I go ahead with my presentation?
Yes, absolutely. Please move forward with your presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so on my part, I was always going to talk about this, trying to wonder, seeing the panels and the speakers that we lined up for this conference. And I'm always like, so when these speakers, the areas of speakers that we are seeing, when they are all from maybe the global south, the global north, why the desire to come south and at least talk to me to just present my thoughts on this topic? But then I just try to give myself that consolation that for every family, there will be a black sheep, and perhaps black thoughts are also very important. And just like Ariel has mentioned, indigenous people are all over the world. And I'm pretty sure that the afflictions of indigenous people in the global north, of course, in the global south here, indigenous people are also facing similar issues. And so this panel session, I quite understand it's for just in 15 minutes or thereabouts. I'm going to be talking on the very issue as regards ransom economy. And just like you've had from the introduction, my thoughts will be structured around climate justice. However, I'm going to tie it around the plight of indigenous people as regards climate change or global warming, as you would prefer. So in this talk, I would just go through all of this presentation in these formats. The introduction, I'm going to respond to the very issue, why the ransom economy, why do we have to think about this particular issue? And also, I will look at the implications of dealing with the issue of ransom economy for indigenous people. Also, I will talk about, or I will briefly look at some of the cases of destructive economy of indigenous people, picking about 2 or 3 cases in the African countries, Kenya, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe to be specific. And perhaps since my work over time has been on a normative study, I'm going to not only go about the problems, I'm going to at least make some suggestions as regards the path to a ransom economy of indigenous people. That is how we could possibly deal with that very challenge that indigenous people are facing all over. Then I round the presentation with a conclusion. Yeah, so next slide, please. So let's get to the introduction. Now we've talked about the ransom economy, and Ariel has done some neat introduction to that issue. And for me, I see the issue of the ransom economy as a justified incursion into the current environmental crisis. And the idea is to provide an alternative ideology that can rescue the economy of indigenous people from the neoliberals. Neoliberalism is that systemic ideology that is ruling and reigning all over. And of course, while there are a whole lot of positives, the freedom talks that neoliberals has given unto us, but then the concern of neoliberals with the environment has not been thought through. And of course, that has implications for the environment all over. And I'll be engaging this very issue from the African perspective, just like I've mentioned. I have worked on the issues of climate change and the way it has affected Africans in the last 4 years. And of course, I will be able to at least say 1 or 2 things that are very, very important as regards the economy of African people and climate change. And so indigenous people in Africa occupy about 50% of the population. And that is why it is very important for us to at least address the economy of these indigenous people, knowing fully well that economy, of course, holds a very important place in the life of people. These indigenous people are faced with numerous challenges that have pushed them to the abyss of poverty and unmitigated suffering. Of course, talking about indigenous people, because of their relationship with the environment, because of the fact that they have little adaptive capacities, a whole lot is happening to them. And of course, in Africa here, there are a whole lot of challenges that indigenous people are facing. They are marginalized. in the discourse of politics, of development, and the current crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic has really exacerbated all of these issues. And of course, it becomes a little bit interesting for us to try and assuage some of these issues. And for me, I've looked at climate change and some other environmental threats that have really affected indigenous people. And of course, I am going to strictly address the ransom economy, the issue of ransom economy, connecting it to the plight of indigenous people as regards climate change. Next slide, please. Now, talking about the problem now of ransom economy, and while it is important to address the problem, the economic resources of indigenous people have been devastatingly affected by climate change. No doubt, when you talk about the continent that has been worst hit by climate change, of course, Africa remains on that top list. And when you think about the fact that they have contributed little to that very problem, it becomes something that one needs to be much more concerned about, to think about how best at least to deal with that very challenge. The indigenous people, of course, are more or less on the front lines of the experience of climate change, especially for the fact that they are very much connected to the environment. And of course, here in Africa, the environment seems to be very, very important for indigenous people. Agriculture seems to be the mainstay of the economy of 70% of the countries in Africa. And so it tells you how interesting it is for them to at least find a voice as regards the plight that they are facing in connection to climate change. Now, in spite of all of these challenges that the indigenous people in Africa are facing with regards to climate change, the drive for economic development has made it difficult to stop and see the devastating effects of all of these on the indigenous people. What we have in the present is that the indigenous communities are still being much plundered and raped of their resources, despite the fact that the effects of climate change has really dealt a devastating blow on them. And so it becomes a little bit important for us to find a way to address that issue. And now it's becoming clearer for us that there is a very interesting connection between the economy and ecology. And this is one connection that the neoliberalists have not been able to at least put in the mainstream. Economy and ecology are two sides of the same coin. And of course, whatsoever we are talking, progress that we are making in the economy, of course, it has a very interesting implication on the environment. And that implication could be negative, it could be positive. And of course, that has to be it has to be brought to the mainstream. And interestingly, the other issue that made it important for us to deal with the ransom economy of indigenous people, particularly in Africa now, is the colonial legacies that are sustained as a result of all of those things. A number of scholars have been dealing with the issue that colonialism is more or less like, climate change is colonialism's natural conclusion. When you think about the logic of colonialism, you would realize that, of course, the colonialists came to Africa, plunder a whole lot of resources to at least develop their own economy. And the resultant effect of the developed economies of the colonialists is what Africa is facing in terms of the effects of climate change. Of course, we cannot try to fold our hands and think all is well. And that is why a conference like this, we have at least come together to start that conversation to think about how we could possibly redeem or ransom the economy of indigenous people. Next slide, please. Now, the problem that I have highlighted in the previous slide, of course, talking about the implications of the problem, if we do not try to deal with it, these are some of the things that it could actually lead to. And number one, I see the fiction of the Homo economicus man. When we think about economies, this was the concept home economy course was actually raised by an economist, I think Mark Robbins or thereabouts. I'm not very sure about the name now. And what he said as regards homo economicus is that human beings over time have been working with that theory, that economic theory, that we are rational and we tend to make decisions that would bring about the best value for us. I mean, in terms of cost benefits. And these particular assumption in economics has interesting implications that we must not try to do away with. When we think about human beings, if we claim human beings are so rational, they are not so rational to the point of thinking about the impact of their choice, their free choice on the environment. And so these age and time, it is important for us to think or to rethink the very notion of human beings, their rationality tending towards a profit motive without a consideration for the environment. When you think about the very understanding of economics these days, we could see that human beings tend to focus on the profit motive, the gains of the shareholders, without thinking about the relationship that comes with it. And all of these things has an effect on the relationship of man with each other and likewise the environment. Another interesting implication that the issue of a ransom economy needs to be dealt with, why it needs to be dealt with is that, of course, there is an inequitable distribution of wealth as we speak. And if we want to get to a point where we will start thinking about solving that problem of equitable distribution of wealth, this very issue of ransom economic has to be dealt with, knowing fully well that the resources that has been used to develop the global north, most of them have been taken from the global south. And so we have to think about indigenous people in the light of trying to address their economy at this point in time. And of course, the value of indigenous knowledge is threatened. This has been said over time in the series of presentations that we have had. Indigenous knowledge is one part of indigenous people. They have so much in terms of wisdom and knowledge that is being affected as a result of climate change, forcing them to migrate from their cherished homelands. And all of these things has effects on the way they pass on that knowledge in terms of from generation to generation. Another implication is that there is the continued loss of subsistence and traditional livelihoods. I have said before now that the subsistence of indigenous people in Africa is based largely on farming. And the very challenge of climate change as we speak at this point in time has affected a whole lot of farm activities, not only in from the angle of making them to leave those farmlands, but also the way climate change has affected the weather. Farmers are not able to understand how to deal with their planting seasons. And as a result of that, a number of them are migrating from these indigenous lands to the cities to look for how best to sustain themselves. Of course, another implication is that culture loss. A whole lot is happening when it comes to the culture of indigenous people. Climate change has had these indirect effects on indigenous people. And when I talk about culture here, I am talking about both the tangible and the intangible cultures. There are a whole lot of things that climate change has done to the culture of indigenous people. And sadly, when it comes to the considerations of the impact of climate change on indigenous people, most of all of those discussions has been focused on the direct impact, and the intangible cultures of people of indigenous communities have not been looked at when it comes to addressing climate change. This is an issue that I also implore that we look at. There is also the linkage between nature, culture, and development that is being affected. Let me talk about maladaptation and forced adaptation. Indigenous people who have had this long-standing connection with their homelands, from the onslaught of climate change, they are forced to leave their homelands. They are forced to leave these cherished places, all in the name of adaptation. And so to tell you that the very concept of adaptation has its undoings on indigenous people, because they are removed from their cherished homelands where they've had a kind of identity with. And of course, this things has a whole lot of psychological support upon them. And once they are forced to leave this homeland, of course, it affects them even psychologically. There's lots of self-determination by indigenous people, especially those who have to lose the whole of their community because of maybe rising sea levels and all of the likes that comes with climate change. They are forced to be in another community different from their community of origin, and they have to be subjected to the whims and caprices of that new community. And so environmental degradation associated with climate change coming from some extraction has turned sacred homelands to sacrifice zones, and all of these things are accumulated together to come to serve as injustice on indigenous people, knowing fully well that they have not contributed anything to some of these things that has befallen them. Next slide, please. Now, let me quickly talk about some of the cases of in Africa needing their economy to be ransomed. When you talk about Kenya, what is happening these days is that in Africa now, because of the underdeveloped nature of most of these countries, they have to resort into getting aids and donors from the Western world. And what is happening presently in Kenya is that Kenya is taking over most of the lands in China is taking over most of the lands in Kenya, and all in the name of donors, in the name of aids. But the critical issue is that most of the times, the kind of aids that China is putting towards Kenya, they are aids that comes in the form of loans. They come in the form of loans, and it also has interesting environmental effects. I mean, the environmental effects of the infrastructures that they are building with all of these loans are not being considered. And this has to be something that we have to look into, because most of those lands, just like I've mentioned, they are lands owned by indigenous people. They are forced to leave those lands, all in the name of trying to bring about development. But in the end, the impact of those development on the environment is not looked at. And of course, in Nigeria, we also have the case of the Niger Delta region, where oil is being drilled, and as we speak now, a lot of fishing and farming activities that used to be part of the community is no longer in place, and the fishing techniques that ought to be passed down the line is gradually dwindling from that land. And of course, this presents a real issue for indigenous community who have a long-standing history of those particular ways of life. And of course, in Zimbabwe, you know how many people heard about the cyclone Indiae that has forced a whole lot of people to leave their community. And of course, it has not only rendered a whole lot of people to be homeless, those who were faced with this particular challenge. Of course, they have to resort into a kind of labor migration. That is, they have to change their labor, the kind of work that they've been doing in their homelands, they have to change it. And of course, these will take them a whole lot for them to really get out from the fishing, the farming that they have been used to learn something that they are not part of. Of course, it has to take a whole lot from them. And so these are critical issues that indigenous people are facing in some of these countries in Africa, and it has to be clearly dealt with. Next slide. Now, I am not just going to talk about the issues that has to do with the problems. Now, let me go to the suggestions of how to deal with the challenges that comes with redeeming the economy of indigenous people. Number one, I suggest a cosmopolitan environmental justice. How do I mean, or what do I mean by cosmopolitan environmental justice? The very literature on environmental justice, when you think through them, they've largely dealt with the issue of environmental justice from a Westocentric perspective. The very understanding of justice, of course, should be a universal phenomenon. And being a universal phenomenon, it doesn't mean that it doesn't has its own cultural a contextual framework. And this has to be something that needs to be taken care of when we are addressing environmental justice. The very understanding of justice should not just be something that we think about, that, oh, justice should be objective. Yes, it is objective, but then it has to come from a point of view, and the challenges that are being faced by indigenous people, they have to be addressed. And that is why one of the scholars dealing with environmental justice talked about the hermeneutic privilege of the of the unjust. The hermeneutic privilege, meaning that they need to be given the opportunity to hear their views, share their stories, tell about how they feel about the challenges of this environmental problems like climate change. So if indigenous people would be served justice, they need to have a seat on the table when some of these issues are being discussed. And next is the wisdom of indigenous people. Of course, Deborah and Terrell have said so much about the wisdom of indigenous people, and indigenous people have so much wisdom. And of course, there are a lot of things that we need to tap from indigenous people at this point in time. But then when it comes to some of these things, we have to really think about it, that how best can we unravel the wisdom of indigenous people and the contribution of this wisdom to their economy. Of course, when you think about the way they have conserved nature, the way they have really managed the kind of resources that they have in such a way that it's not just only sustaining them in the present, but of course it has a long-term consequence for the sustenance of their economy. So we need to think about how we could possibly drill into the wisdom of indigenous people. And these connect with the third solution that I'm suggesting, which is making the informal formal. This is very critical. And when it comes to the indigenous knowledge, just like the previous speaker made mention, how do we connect people with the indigenous knowledge? Of course, it becomes important for us to make the informal knowledge, to make them formal. The kind of epistemic, the epistemic framework of indigenous people, we have to find a way to bring it to the mainstream. And one interesting suggestion is that when it comes to the resources in indigenous communities, there must be a way to phrase them so that it could be something that the world will know that these are important things for these indigenous people. And this requires us to put values on this indigenous knowledge. There is a difference between held values and assigned values. Held values are the values that some of these resources have in themselves, but assigned values are the values that these indigenous people place on some of these things. For example, talk about a river. A river and the importance of a river to indigenous communities goes beyond just a natural phenomenon. Of course, it serves them things like water, it serves them things like for irrigation. And so when describing the effects of, say, climate change on such river, the way we describe them should feign much more importance than just being the natural environment. And so the fourth thing that I recommend is that we should start challenging the logic of neoliberalism. When it comes to neoliberalism, there is a whole lot that is going on at this point in time. The very logic of growth, economic emancipation that neoliberals have sold to us over time, we have gradually seen that this particular story is not complete because it never factored the implications of economic growth on the environment. And of course, human beings are built for not just for making money or acquiring wealth. They're also built for relationship with themselves and their environment. And this has been rightly demonstrated amongst the indigenous people. And so there must be a conscious attempt to replace a world that has been found, that has been created with the very logic of the ethics of care. We must think about how indigenous community care for their environment and how they've been able to uphold that relationship between themselves and the environment. And this is something that is lacking in a neoliberalist framework. And also, when it comes to addressing the economy of indigenous people, we must try as much as possible to seek for the implementation of the indigenous people rights. Of course, this has been in the mainstream for a while, that indigenous people have some cultural rights that needs to be addressed. But sadly, up to this point, those rights have not been given utmost priority. And these rights are very, very important at this period when environmental crisis seems to be biting hard on indigenous people. And lastly, for the suggestion, we need to start thinking about indigenous environmental policy, not just as a spotlight, but as the toolkit. And how do I mean here? Thinking about indigenous environmental policy, talking about the wisdom, the knowledge that is in indigenous communities, we must not only present them as though they are the victims of some of these environmental crises. We must also be able to tell the story of how this indigenous knowledge could be a veritable solutions to a number of things afflicting the modern economy. We've talked about the very concept of resilience that comes with indigenous people, the very concept of frugality. Some of these things are part of indigenous economy that the modern economy can learn from. And so it becomes important for us to think about ways to make all of these ideas not just a spotlight, but to make them a toolkit. Next slide, please. So I conclude with the very notion that trying to ransom indigenous economy is just going to be like a long walk to freedom. And of course, it tells us that just like we are having this conference, the debate has started, the conversation is on there. We should try as much as possible to keep that conversation going, to keep sharing some of those ideas about indigenous people that needs to be dealt with. What the ICA is doing is a very, very interesting work. These issues as regards indigenous economy has not been so much popularized. And if in Canada, for example, if it has gone into the mainstream, in Africa, these things are still very much in the background, and it needs to be brought to the mainstream. It needs to be popularized. And so doing that, of course, is not going to be something easy. It's a hard work, and more than ever before, the indigenous people now have a voice that can reach far and wide. And through platforms like these, propagating those voices to the places and the people that needs to hear them, of course, is going to be much more easier. And one interesting thing is that when we are trying to push those voices out there, we should be very conscious of the way we do it. It must be rationally orchestrated rather than emotionally deployed. If we really want to make the world out there to focus on the economy, the interesting things, the very positives in the economies of indigenous people, the way we present that economy needs to be very, very rational, very, very interesting, very valuable. It's more or less like we are making the invincible visible, and that is a task for scholars at this very point in time. And so the fight for a ransom economy is not just a signpost, it is for humanity's sake. And I think this conference would go a long way in addressing this very plight for indigenous economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such an insightful and amazing presentation on really looking at like what the ransom economy is. For me, what I found so interesting about it is that there are so many parallels to the issues that are happening in Africa that are happening here in Canada as well. So thank you very, very much. We're going to take you off the spotlight and I'll bring Larry into the conversation, then we'll all come back for some Q&A. But thank you so much. That was such a wonderful presentation. And I just can't wait to get into the parallels of what's happening here in this country. So Larry, I'm going to start with a little bit of a presentation in context to issues sort of in Canada and in my region at the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, and just sort of some of the stuff we've also seen that is so similar to what we just heard about. Like, I can't even begin to, I'll just share. And then Larry, I'd invite you to add some of your experiences as a representative of a legal firm that helps Indigenous communities in Canada navigate the precarities of these agreements that come from the context of the industries that are working with communities. I just realized I didn't even speak your bio. So before I do that, I'm going to introduce Larry super quickly, and you can say hello. So Larry is a partner with OKT Law, and I don't know how to say Othelius. Is it Othelius? Othelius Clear Township. I just know them as OKT, practicing in the area of Indigenous rights and environmental law. Larry has worked with First Nations on lands and resource issues for more than 25 years and has developed extensive experience in the negotiation of impacts and benefit agreements, environmental assessment, co-management measures, and treaty provisions. He currently represents and advises First Nations dealing with major mining, forestry, and energy developments, and is also involved in several leading First Nation conservation and land use planning initiatives across Canada. So Larry, I'm going to pass it to you for a minute just to say anything that I may have missed, and then I'm going to do a quick little presentation.
I think that's good for now, Ariel. And Ariel and I worked together for many, many years in the struggle of her own community, of the Athabasca Chippewa, around tar sands and other forms of development.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is a great conversation. So back to you, Ariel, and I'll just pick it up after you do the framing for us.
Awesome. So I'm going to open up a little bit of a presentation here and start here. So these are some moccasins. I always like to start with just a little bit of grounding and context to who I am as a person. And I really like this photo because I feel like it really embodies me as a person. So I'm actually wearing a pair of moccasins that were my babas or my grandfathers or my Setsiune. And these are super old. You can see the fur is all ratty and old, but I'm wearing them in the Northern Territory in Australia. And so this is the red earth of the Northern Territory in Australia, where Indigenous communities are fighting the expansion of fracking, where they're fighting to assert their autonomy of their lands and territories in their region. And I'm wearing these moccasins of my grandfather on this other side of the planet, connecting with Indigenous peoples. And I just felt like this photo just really embodies who I am, because I take who I am as a member of the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation or the Kaitale Dene Sotlene people with me everywhere. And so Kaitale means people of the willow. And it's a representation of where we come from, the Athabasca Delta. And this is a place that's full of marshlands and rocky, sort of the little bit of the shield in there. It's actually one of the most unique places on the planet, so much so that it's been recognized by UNESCO. And the Wood Buffalo National Park and the rich biodiversity of the forests and the fens and the lakes and the marshlands all together has been recognized for its rich biodiversity. But it's not just a place. These are places that nurtured the identities and the culture of my people, the Athabasca Chippewa First Nation. From the waters that we drank, to the foods that we ate, the medicines, to the languages and the culture that we have is fully embodied. Dene means to flow from the land. And that's who we truly, truly are. And so this is a photo of me and my siblings out on the land, because we used to stay in a walled tent in the summer as a kid, every summer, almost for the whole summer, and live off the land. I'm talking hauling our water, back cooking our meals over the fire, the whole 9 yards. The only way we communicate with folks with it was with a radio that my parents had. It was so far off in the bush, no roads. And these are the places that nurtured us and taught us the values that we heard about from Deborah today, and we also heard about in the presentation just prior to us. This rich knowledge of an understanding of our land is critical. I did talk a little bit earlier today about Indigenous peoples representing 5% of the global population, thousands of distinct groups where we occupy and use, depends on who you talk to, between 22 to 64% of the world's land surface to actualize our culture and our rights as Indigenous peoples. And that represents 80% of the world's global biodiversity and 85% of the world's protected and conservation areas. And this is where we start to get into the crux of like ransom economies. We heard from the previous speaker that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a critical component, and it is. And one of the reasons why it becomes critically important when we talk about ransom economies is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is an internationally adopted instrument, and it was passed in 2007. Almost 2 decades of negotiations were held with Indigenous peoples. And what makes it so unique is that Indigenous peoples had a hand in developing it. That's never happened before. And to be totally fair, it's never happened since. So it's very, very unique. And it has these beautiful tenets that weave in the collective rights of our communities and our relationships with the natural world. And a lot of people ask, well, what's the difference between human rights and the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples? Because why do they need special rights? So first off, it needs to be understood that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created in 1946, when Indigenous peoples in many parts of the world did not have personhood. And in Canada, we had no right to vote in 1946. Indigenous peoples had no constitutional rights to participate in civic and elections and processes and governance or managements of our lands and territories, despite the treaties that were signed, which I'll get into. And so that's one element of it. The second piece is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights focuses on our individual rights, which we absolutely need individual rights and freedoms. This is not to negate or take away from that, but Indigenous communities work within a collective framework. So the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights focuses on collective rights, the rights of the community to exist in their natural places in relationship with lands and territories. And one of the most important tenets of this declaration is free, prior, informed consent. Look at this. I took it right from OKT. It's almost like it's a perfect match. It's like I made this slide just for this presentation, which I'm not going to talk too much about because I would love to hear more from Larry, but it's really about this idea, like, why is this so important? Free of coercion, intimidation, and manipulation, the right to say no, prior to, meaning that the information is given to communities and shared in a way that's accessible. And like, so that means like way before. This means it's not after the project's been started that you then ask for consent. And then informed means that it's easy to understand, analyze, and be able to have access to that information in a real way. So it's got to have all sides. So if there's a missing piece, that information needs to be collected before the decision can be made. And then the last piece is consent. And so that communities can say yes or no. In Canada, however, we've degraded that C into consultation, which we can talk about a little bit more. But just to understand the legal frameworks, which I'm sure Larry could talk to quite a bit, is we talk about, we often hear, oh, we're all treaty people. This country was founded on these treaty agreements. We get these beautiful pictures of the colonizers shaking hands with the Indigenous person, and we're like, Canada is so great. We have such amazing relationships with our communities because we signed all these treaties. But when you actually look at a treaty map of Canada, you start to go, wait a second. So all the colored areas that aren't yellow are where all the treaties have taken place. What about all the yellow? That is a very good question, folks, because the reality is that there are still large tracts of this country that remain untreated, meaning that there are no agreements for how those lands, like treaty agreements, nation-to-nation understandings. There have been agreements in Nunavut and Nunavut and other places, but they're not at the same level of treaty agreements. And why is that important? Because one of the first founding treaties of the Confederation that is now known as Canada was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, not 1963, although it could feel like that. But this proclamation of 1763 said that they would not take up any land in this country without first making a treaty with the Indigenous peoples. And what we have seen, however, is that mass tracts of land continue to be taken up for resources that without the consent of communities and without treaty agreements. And this is very important. And again, We were going to share the land. Treaty, I come from treaty number 8. We were told we're going to share the land. We'll have the rights to, to say what happens within our lands and territories. We'll have access to always freely hunt, fish, and trap and gather. The state will continue to provide for us, so on and so forth, and share the abundance that exists within our territories. But instead, what we've seen is that instead of having jurisdiction over our lands and territories, there's been this degradation of what treaty means. And Indigenous communities are relegated to our reserve lands. And this is a map of all of the different reserves and settlements of Canada. And it actually represents only 0.2% of the land mass in Canada, where we have full say over anything that happens, where we're able to say yes or no. That's it. The other 99.8% is the Crown, where the Crown can ultimately determine what's in the public interest and override the rights of Indigenous communities, which is actually an abrogation or a breach of law, or an interpretation, we should say, because Canada will argue that fact. But this leaves us with very little ability to influence economy. So much of Canada remains on stolen land. And there are lots of people that are talking about the reality is that Canada is a celebration of white supremacy, colonial violence, ongoing land theft, and Indigenous genocide, with the recent findings of 215 children and the ongoing legacy of the residential school system and this dispossession of our people from our lands and territories. We start to see that the painting of the picture of this country is much different than it is. So what happens when we are not given the ability to control what happens in our lands and territories? Projects like this. This is an Alberta oil sands or tar sands operator that is upstream from my community. This project has been considered one of the largest industrial projects on planet Earth and also one of the dirtiest oil projects. And what's very concerning is in this photo, on the right-hand side is the river system, the Athabasca River system, which feeds into our community, which is fed from a glacier. And, it actually continues to travel northward all the way to the Arctic Ocean and is the lifeline for many, many Indigenous communities, including my own. And you could see how precariously close the operations of this project are to the shores of this river. So close, in fact, that if you have a good enough arm, you can stand on the edge of the line of the road and throw a rock into the river system. And these projects are contaminating and degrading the environment, as well as the ability for our communities to practicing our cultural and spiritual practices and relationships with the land. And we were not a part of these projects because they began at a time when we were not given any say, where the government determined what was best for us, when there was a very patriarchal relationship. Since this time, much has changed because of the plights of our communities and the support from legal firms and councils like Larry Innes in supporting our nations to fight to be able to have more of a say in how these projects move forward. So the economies that have been forced into our communities tend to look like extractive, destructive projects where I'm going, WTF, tar sands, Canada for real? Like, this is a degradation of our treaty and Aboriginal rights in this country. And it moves away from the traditional knowledge that guided the practices to protect our lands and territories for millennia. And Indigenous knowledge is the knowledge an Indigenous or local community accumulates over generations of living in a particular environment. And why is that important? In the context of climate and in the world economies, our forests are incredibly important. And Indigenous peoples manage 11% of the world's forests, where we're actually managing it. And we occupy between 22 and 65% of the world's land surface. And within that context of how we utilize and where we manage, it contains more than 312 billion tons of carbon sequestration, meaning that our forests and our lands are responsible for stabilizing the climate. that knowledge, those systems and economies that we thrived on of abundance and reciprocity need to be valued and looked at how they can be integrated into current frameworks. And we cannot underscore the importance of Canada's boreal forests. The boreal forest, we often think of the great forests of the world as the Amazon. And if you can see behind here, there's like the lungs that I have on the side, and then we have the two photos over here. And the top photo is the Athabasca Delta with the boreal forest, and the one below is the Amazon rainforest. I have visited, I'm from the boreal forest, and I visited the Amazon in Indigenous communities, and I can tell you was wild to me because I felt like I was at home in my own community, except it was really humid and really hot. But they even had res dogs. I was like, oh my God, they have res dogs. The culture and the way that people are and their relationships with these places, the way that I felt in their forests was so similar to the way that I felt at home. And I recognized the bond that our two forests play in the stabilization of our planet, and that we cannot underscore the importance. I'm going to skip this slide, but it's not just a boreal forest. It is the home and territories of many Indigenous peoples of this country, from the Tahltan to the Saulteaux to the Ojibwe, to the Algonquins, to the Blackfoot, to the Dene, to the Chilcotin, and so on and so forth. These lands and territories that house this are not just places, they are the places that our people have procured and protected for generation after generation, and they are of severe significance to not just our economic systems, but to climate stabilization. And this is just a map of where we see high organic carbon mass. Like, it's wild to think about Canada's role in this. It's not just our boreal forests, it's everywhere. And you start to see the anthropogenic footprint. And this is where we talk about economies. Where is this anthropogenic footprint? Okay, cities is obvious, but let's look at the province of Alberta. What is that anthropogenic footprint? It is the industrial sectors, from electricity to manufacturing to mining and quarrying. Oil and gas and other sectors are what are disrupting and destabilizing our forests and systems and the communities of these Indigenous peoples, which have pushed aside our economic centers and our livelihoods for the last 500 plus years. It's critical that Indigenous peoples have a vital role in not just moving forward what it means for us to develop climate policies and how our lands might be able to safeguard things. But we make up 15% of the world's poorest people, yet we sit atop of some of the richest resources that are being utilized and extracted to prop up capitalist frameworks and perpetuate the climate crisis while we remained locked into ransom economies that push our traditional economies further and further to the side. With that, I just wanted to say, like, within my own community, we are experiencing this huge influx of all these multinational corporations. And how are we dealing with that now? What are we doing in relation to these big projects coming in? When they first started in my region, we had no rights. These projects were approved, they were sort of blanketed, and the only way for us to get any kind of benefit from them was to participate. It was to get a job. But the racism was so staunch that we didn't even get jobs. They were like, we don't want to hire Indians. They literally were like, there's no way we're hiring these people. And the success story, which is almost sad in my nation, is that our business group, which is called ACTEN, started because one of the members of our nation started picking up trash around one of the sites because he was so tired of seeing all the waste. And then someone said, oh, well, I'll pay you to pick up trash. And then soon he was picking up more trash, and soon he was bringing more members to pick up more trash. So we have literally been cleaning up the messes of these industries. And that's how we got our foot in the door, by cleaning up their messes. And now my nation has a group of companies that are largely service providers to literally continue to clean up the messes of these industries. And that is our participation in these ransom economies. It's not because we support them, it's because we're doing what's best to try to protect and safeguard our lands, our territories, our cultures, and our identities from these things. And yet we are continually told that if you're working and getting jobs and making money from it, you have no right to say anything bad about it. But the reality is these projects are still an abrogation of our rights. They still obstruct our ability to access our lands, territories, waterways in a safe and healthy way. Everyone has the right to a healthy environment and safe drinking water. And these projects are an abrogation to it. This is just in my territory, but we've heard from the previous speaker that this is something that's happening across the board. And I'm going to wrap up there because we've seen changes. And this is where I want to invite Larry in to the legal frameworks and how Indigenous peoples have been advocating for the restoration of our rights and being able to fight for and advocate and challenge these systems, but how we're still locked into these ideas of ransom economies. So I'll pass it to Larry.
Thanks, Ariel. And yeah, so many good sort of junction points to begin, but maybe a story, a little bit of a flashback. I think it was 2014, and ACFN, who Ariel was working for at the time, invited Desmond Tutu to come and speak in Fort McMurray. And it was an event that involved Desmond Tutu, Miles Richardson, Winona LaDuke. It was a fantastic lineup of speakers, including Mike Mercredi, who I'm very sad isn't here today. But it was focused on this question of what is a proper treaty relationship? You know, the words, as long as the rivers flow, are found in many of the historic treaties as part of a promise. And whether that promise was made in good faith or not, I guess we'll still, the jury's still out on that. But the promise made at the time the treaties were made was this relationship, which was intended to be a nation-to-nation relationship, intended to be a reciprocal relationship, formed on a partnership to share responsibilities for the land, because no one, of course, could own land, was the foundation, or one of the foundation stories of what has become Canada. Unfortunately, it's also one of the stories that is only held on to by one of the treaty partners, by the Indigenous side, who continues to try and find ways to remind Canada of the underlying promise that these treaties represented. So beginning with this idea of as long as the rivers flow, and bringing international activists to Fort McMurray, literally the heart of the tar sands, to sit in a building with ACFN members, community members, and others to begin to unpack what that treaty relationship should be, was the purpose of the gathering. And Archbishop Tutu began his presentation. You can picture the room. It's the big hall of the ACFN's Acton building. It's a big open space, beautiful windows. It's a wonderful gathering space. And he's a relatively short man, and he stands up on the stage in front of all of the people and he says, "Hello, my fellow Africans," to a room of mostly Indigenous people who look at him like, "Yeah, what are you talking about?" And he says again, with his laugh, "Hello, my fellow Africans." And he then launches into his sermon, which I can only call it a sermon, where he tells the story of ultimately we all share the same planet and we all come, again in one telling of the story, from the same place, from Africa. And, I think this particular panel has, as I've been listening and thinking and reminiscing about some of the ways in which these conversations flow together, these different streams of knowledge and experience flow together. And, beginning with what Abby Odun began with about the Ransom Economy, which in many ways has its roots in the European relationship with Africa. The first time I ever encountered the phrase a ransom economy was in relation to the slave trade. So here we are now in 2021, having a conversation which is still premised on these asymmetrical relationships between one group of people who have a particular way of relating to the world based on power and on process and on laws they make and impose on other people's space, and those people who have their space imposed on. And fundamentally, that's the other story of Canada. That's the dominant story of Canada, is that somehow a bunch of people from Europe got on boats and took their languages, their laws, their ways of relating to each other, and imposed them on lands that were not their own. And they did so through a variety of methods. You know, there was disease, there was warfare, there was dispossession, there was, well, I could go on for quite some time telling the story of the last 500 years, but most of you in the room know it much better than I do. We're here now at this place at the end of, or maybe in the latest chapter of this history, but it's drawing to its natural close. As the earth itself, which always passed last, she's telling us what the limits are. We share a planet that has a finite number of resources, and it has only one way to live, which is in relationship with all other life on the planet. And you know, those people who started the systems that now enframe and enclose and in many ways define what our relationship is to land, to the planet, and to each other, are now being confronted very directly, as Abiodun and Ariel have noted, by the realities that, you know, their economic system, their way of relating to the planet based on laws and processes that are entirely fictional, that have no lived reality other than through force and oppression, are encountering the fact that there are limits to that too. And this is the moment we're in now. So how do we find our way forward? And perhaps a couple of stories. And again, sticking within Denendeh, and I'm speaking to you from Samba Cay, Yellowknife, as it's also known, which is the home of the Yellowknife's Dene, and it's in many ways the heartland of the Dene Nation that extends from Alaska to Arizona and all of the space in between. And the peoples who all call themselves Dene share common languages and common experiences that extend back well past the last ice age. And so finding ourselves here in the middle of that long history, and finding ourselves in this more modern history of how treaty relationships have been made or unmade north and south of this magical line we call the 60th parallel, where on one side, the Northwest Territories and the nations that make up the Northwest Territories are part of historic treaties, but have created a very different relationship to the Canadian state. And those who live south of that line, you know, Ariel's community, the Idenasutane, stretch across the Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and are, of course, related to the rest of Denendeh. But the experience of Ariel's community in particular, ACFN, Fort Chipewyan, which the territory straddles this line. And in the south, in Alberta, the rules are written one way. In the north, in the Northwest Territories, where modern relationships are being formed, the rules work quite differently. It's almost two different worlds. And you know, as a Canadian lawyer trying to understand this in terms of lines and jurisdictions, it's a challenge, because it makes no sense from a constitutional perspective, just staying within the limits of how Canadian law is drawn, for the rights to be viewed so differently. But they are. and it's fundamentally unjust and fundamentally unsupportable. But we continue to struggle to make the case in as many ways as we can that the ultimate underlying treaty relationship is one of shared decision-making between different peoples who comfortably or uncomfortably occupy the same lands and ultimately need to find themselves in a proper relationship with each other and those lands if Canada as an idea is going to succeed, and if any nation is going to get out of this trap that the ransom economy has created. I mean, you've all seen the Bruce Willis movie. It doesn't end well for anyone, and we have to get off that skyscraper. So how do we do that? What are some of the ways? Well, a couple of stories. So let me start with Lützelke, which is another Dene Sultanate community very closely related to the Kaitele Dene in Fort Chipewyan. And they had a very different experience. It was in the late 1960s, and Canada looked at their territory as Canada did. It brought out its maps, it had its particular view of what should happen. And they drew a big line around the territory. But instead of dedicating it to oil and gas development in the way that happened in Alberta, they said, we're going to make this a park. We're going to protect this for, I don't know, tourist nature. They had lots of reasons. And the story is somewhat famous in the Northwest Territories and rightly beyond, because a bunch of bureaucrats got on a Twin Otter, flew from Yellowknife, which was the seat of colonial government, to Lützelke with a big roll of maps. And they sat down with the chief at the time, a man who's now passed by the name of Pierre Catholic. And they said, Chief, we're here to tell you that we're going to make a national park in your territory. And they unrolled the maps, and it was virtually the entire territory that the community used for, at the time, and in many ways still, is a subsistence-based economy. It's a community that has none of the modern conveniences that you would expect in 21st century Canada. People largely live in the same houses that they had in the 1950s. They eat with wood, they draw their own water. Many houses are still on honey buckets. It's a community that, from a development perspective, has many challenges. But from a Dene perspective, it's a community that maintains a connection to its land, its language, its way of life, and has had I won't say the luxury, because that's the wrong word. It has had the luck of not being at the center of colonial and industrial expansion until recently. And in the 1960s, this was even more the case. So when Canada rolls out the maps and says, Chief, we're going to make this national park to protect your territory, his question was, from what? And the only answer they could give him is, well, people are over hunting. And he's like, people are hunting the way they have always hunted. We've maintained our relationships with caribou for many, many years, and those things are never going to change. You're talking crazy. This makes no sense. Take your maps and go. And interestingly, at the time, that's what happened. The bureaucrats rolled up their maps, they left, and the chief then went to meet with other chiefs and said, I've just had the strangest meeting with the government. They came with these maps, they wanted to protect our land, they wanted to do all of these things, and they wanted us to stop hunting. That's the wrong thing for us. We need to organize. And this is one of the creation stories of what ultimately became the Assembly of First Nations. So, this idea that whether governments are coming for good reason or bad reason, who knows? The idea that they're coming with the ideas in their own minds of what is best for communities is the wrong place to begin. And this has now come around perhaps full circle, where in the mid-1990s, the same community was faced with an onslaught of exploration activity when diamonds were discovered in the Northwest Territories. And literally overnight, the community went from being a relatively quiet place where no one ever visited to a place where helicopters buzzed overhead 24/7, because you can do that in the summer here, where people were literally having to chase people out of their backyards, of their shacks, who were trying to pound in stakes to claim land for diamond exploration. And the community rallied and began in earnest to draw down whatever power and authority they had to protect those lands. And they did so in a variety of ways. We don't have all the time in the world to tell all those stories, and many of those stories are really the communities to tell. But long story short, they found their way back to a table with Canada, where they said, we are going to protect our land. And that conversation that you were beginning in the 1960s about creating a national park is something that we might be interested in, but only on our terms. It took another decade, but the community was successful in concluding an establishment agreement for an Indigenous protected area under Dene law, which was then matched by the Crown with a national park reserve under federal law. The territorial government got involved, did a little bit on the side, but again, that's a whole other story. The point of the story is that there is a way of making treaty, and there is a way of building relationships that do not ultimately revert to the procedural and the transactional and the ultimately commodifying relationships that we see in so much of what passes for Indigenous government relations in Canada or Crown Indigenous relations in Canada. But actually go back to the beginning, which is, how do we meet? And Deb McGregor used the term ethical space. How do we meet in ethical space, recognizing that we share a planet, that we share a history, that we share a hope of a future for our children that is not terrifying, where ecological collapse, climate crises, food security, and all of these things should be top of mind for all of us as humans. How do we create a space where those conversations can occur in a contemporary sense, using our law, and when I say our law, Canadian law and Indigenous law, to create a Canada which is actually built on reciprocity and relationship and on the sense of our limits as humans on a planet we share with many other forms of life. So I wish I had more time to talk about the other sides of the stories. Ariel, I think, has touched on many of those, but I hope that in the questions and answers we can get into not just the nature of the problem, but what some of the solutions might look like. So Masi.
Thank you so much, Larry. I think we can invite Abu. I keep saying your name wrong. I'm going to go back to the pronunciation over here. Abby Odun. Abby Odun. Back into the circle. And I just wanted to first just do some reflections while we do that. Larry is absolutely right. Like, when that was a great example, the Letsuke conservation area park is such a beautiful way of reframing what it can look like when we center Indigenous values and economics and all of these things. Because what has happened is the opposite. What we've seen is projects and resource extraction projects being developed with those that are coming in and racing to put stakes in the ground without any consent of those people, or in tar sands or in any of the other areas, moving forward projects to the Crown without consent of Indigenous peoples, which has actually threatened those Indigenous ways of being and knowing for decades. And in Canada, what we've developed is this framework that Larry's been a part of, is impact benefit agreements, where Canada said, oh, I know we're supposed to ask for your consent and we're supposed to make sure that you're getting a fair deal. But what you should do is you should just figure that out with the company. And this is where it gets really even more complicated and insidious in Canada, because instead of us because we fought for this, like with folks like Larry, where we fought to be like, no, we need to be able to say no, we need to be able to interject, we have to be able to intervene, we have to protect our lands, our water, our territories, our culture. And they said, okay, yeah, sure, we agree with you, you do need to protect all of that, because we agreed to it in treaty, and I guess we have a right, a fiduciary obligation to do that. And they're like, oh, but we just don't have the manpower or the resources. So because you're sovereign, you can just figure it out with the company. And now Indigenous nations are no longer negotiating with the nation of Canada. We're negotiating with corporations. And there's been this devolution of that fiduciary responsibility to our communities to now advocate for ourselves with private entities that are not governments, where we have to then negotiate what it means for us to be able to be okay with, and not even consent to be okay with. And this is where it starts to get into even more of that ransom economy, because then it becomes a negotiation of how much is it going to cost us to be able to do this project, as opposed to our ability to work with the state to say, we don't want this, or for the state to have an obligation to share the resources or the profits from the resources that are being extracted with our community on a fair sort of platform, which doesn't happen in this country. Instead, resources are taken, and Indigenous nation and the funding that goes to our communities has had negligible increases for the last 50 years, even though resources continue, of the billions of dollars, continue to be extracted from our communities. And we end up in situations where we're pushed out, just like we heard from Abby Odun. I'm getting it right, Abby Odun. We heard from Abby Odun in this situation in Africa, is where these communities just get pushed further and further away until they're marginalized and we in poverty and dispossessed. And then the government says, oh, we'll just figure out how much it's going to be okay for you to get out of this with the company. And so now our communities are impoverished from no longer being able to access our kitchens and our medicine cabinets, i.e. the lands and our territories. And subsistence living is super important in this context. And I think both the presenters talked about this. Subsistence living is so important because we act as if like hunting and fishing is a recreational activity, but hunting, fishing, and gathering is actually an economic activity that is critical to these communities. In my own community, subsistence food sources are such a vital part of the food and the diet that it's actually an economic subsidy. So prior to the last couple of years, our nation, we built a cooperative grocery store. It's super awesome. We now have affordable food, which is amazing. But that's only been in the last, like, was it 3 years now? Like 3 years they opened up the grocery store. Prior to that, like a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, food was astronomical in cost. And traditional food sources were critical to survive. Like otherwise you couldn't afford a good meal. You had to be able to hunt, gather, fish, and trap in order to be able to eat. And there was testimony from one of our community members at one of our hearings against one of the proponents one year, where their freezer broke. Their hunting freezer, where they stored all their berries and food, and they were out on the land, so they didn't know. And when they came home, this freezer full of like berries and meat and all of these things had gone bad, and this person struggled for the rest of the year because they couldn't afford to replace that food. And this economic piece is not included. What happened to Abby Odun? We're going to go into conversations. Bring him back to the spotlight. Bring it back to the spotlight. So I wanted to ask a question to the panelists: is how do we look at undoing the undoing? And I know you gave us some really great examples of these systems of ransom economies, and really push to advocate for those traditional economies. Like, how do we get them from just being like, oh, Indigenous knowledge, it's so, it's really beautiful, it's pretty, but how do we move it from that framework that Larry talked about, where the Letsuke now has control and management of their territories in these places that are actually resource rich? How do we move the window to get Indigenous rights to actually be actualized, instead of degraded down to negotiations with proponents or being pushed to the side so big multinationals can come in? What are some major steps that you think are possibility for our communities to get out of this ransom economy? Just a little question.
Should I go first?
Please.
Can I go first? All right. Yeah. That's a very interesting question. And if you ask me how best to organize indigenous communities in such a way that they would get the grip of the ransom economy of them, just like I've mentioned in the presentation, that it becomes important for indigenous economy to, first of all, make those informal ideas, informal knowledge, they have to bring them to the mainstream. Very, very critical. And one thing that, one analogy that always comes to mind is when you think about technology, for instance, and you think about coding, algorithms are written for programs. And of course, we all use some of these programs. And somehow we benefited a whole lot from it, even while we are not able to understand the coding language like the specialists. But then we've enjoyed so much of the benefits of coding. The same thing with indigenous communities now. We just have to, first of all, bring those ideas, bring those knowledge to the mainstream in such a way that the community, I mean, the wider community benefits from this wisdom. They benefits from these ideas, and these ideas has a connection with the development of the economy in the mainstream. And so once these ideas are already there, that people can benefit from them, of course, it becomes something that perhaps the government will be willing to at least try to understand and try to seek ways to improve on those ideas in such a way that it becomes popularized. And perhaps after then, we will start having policies, legislations to support some of this indigenous knowledge. So I think the onus lies on perhaps scholars to go back to all of these indigenous communities, not just to think about the advocacy, but to find a way to bring the latent ideas in this indigenous knowledge, indigenous communities, and try to put it together in such a way that it can be sold to the larger populace, that anyone engaging with indigenous knowledge, indigenous wisdom, they can see the benefit of it, even without trying to go down into the communities. So I think that will be helpful a whole lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Maybe just riffing off what Abiodun just said about indigenous knowledge. We heard from Deb McGregor and others about the making indigenous law visible. So it's not a radical idea to suggest that crown governments that are prepared to authorize a development with some form of permitting process, that they've cooked up, are only one of the consents that a developer requires. The other part, the other side of the treaty is, of course, the indigenous side. The indigenous government operating under indigenous law must also approve the project before it can proceed. And it's a simple idea to explain. And it's an idea that when, again, we think about the foundation of treaty making, the Royal Proclamation of 1863, and this is something that I wish was better understood by all Canadians, was Imperial Britain saying, when we go and colonize a country, the laws that exist in that country stay intact, and our British imperial laws, which of course are better, get layered on top. And that's what a treaty is it's ultimately the ways in which the two nations and their legal systems agree to structure their relationship going forward. And I'll say for the first 300 years of Canada, that was how things worked. Indigenous peoples were militarily superior economically superior. They had the force of numbers. The little tiny, the little tiny hovels that European settlements occupied were there by the grace of the Mi'kmaq, the Haudenosaunee, that we could go on until they weren't. And that didn't change until the early part of the 1800s. So if that was the law then, that's the law now. Indigenous law has never been displaced. It's been submerged and suppressed. It's been oppressed, but that is not justice. So bringing Indigenous law out of the shadows, giving it its actual space as one of the foundations, one of the legal foundations, one of the constitutional foundations on which Canada, if it's going to call itself a civilization or a country built on law, must respect. It's not hard to think in those terms, especially when you consider that the last 150 years of denial and oppression is something that Canada's nominally apologized for. They did it again this week. They'll do it again next week. But until Canadians stop saying sorry and actually start to act on the facts of the history to make the changes that are necessary, these tragedies will continue. And we can't allow that to continue.
Thank you so much. I think also it should be reminded, folks, is that the UN Declaration is another tool within that tool shed. It's not just about the treaty agreements, because there are many areas that have no treaty agreements globally and internationally, and even in parts of Canada, that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples actually states, I think it's in which article? Article 32? Yes, I'll pull it up. I'm going to read it because I think it's really important to understand. So Article 32 states that Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands or territories and resources. And it ties directly to Article 4, which states that Indigenous peoples, because it's one of the first articles, Indigenous peoples in exercising the right to self-determination have the right or autonomy or self-governance in matters relating to the internal and local affairs, as well as the ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. And I think that's important because that goes into our existing laws. They're there, that they are paramount, and we determine how they function and work. And then on top of it, we have the right to determine what happens on our lands and territories with Article 30, with Article 32. And so it doesn't matter if there's a treaty agreement. And I love what you brought forward, Abby O'Doon, is that aspect of the informal to the formal, because without that aspect, like, it's just saying that it's anecdotal, it's not real. We have to make it on par with current structure, like current governance, current decision-making processes, current best practices. And there is an international movement towards this right now. The UNDRIP was part of it, but even within the context of climate change, which is so important to framing these new economies. And we heard a lot yesterday around the need to move towards economies that are in line with the environment for the sake of the climate crisis, is that this context of within the Paris Agreement, we're seeing this movement that Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous rights is on par with science and Western science to develop those solutions and tools. And so we need to be moving, not just thinking about that just within the context of climate change and science, but how we manage and govern our lands and territories that has led to this displacement and this ability for multinational corporations to hold not just the lands hostage, but those communities hostage. Looks like we actually have a couple questions. I'm going to ask one more question. So there's two questions. I'm going to ask them together. Should governments be allowed to give land tenures for exploration and resources, like colonial governments, I'm assuming? And curious about the thoughts about ways to address the fact that property rights, generally individual, are central to mainstream economic tools and analysis used in corporate and government decision making. Is it possible to reconcile property rights and Indigenous worldviews of land through an ethical space? So is there a way to reconcile property rights, and should governments be allowed to give land tenure for exploration for resources? And we'll leave it at that, and then we'll wrap it up because we're a little over already.
Let me deal with the first one really quickly. Stolen land is stolen land. And until the relationships are structured correctly, the premise that the Crown, as one party to a treaty, or in many cases of Canada, as someone who has no treaty, who's simply asserting a right, should have no validity. Yet we have a system which obviously gives them all of the power and puts the historical fact of prior occupancy, use, ownership of Indigenous people living on those lands under their own laws, under their own systems, to the side, and pretends that history started yesterday or in 1867 or whatever. So that whole line of Crown governments being able to act unilaterally, we're slowly chipping away at that in Canada's legal system. So that's becoming much more problematized, even in mainstream law. On the issue of property rights, wow, I wish we had another hour, because that's really the heart of the question, is how do we reframe the idea of property rights rather than being ownership of a thing, but a relationship with each other through the lens of treaty in ways that also respect other forms of creation. And that whole conversation is one that we need a whole other conference on.
Thank you so much. Would you like to add anything, Abiodun?
Yeah, just a little one. Very interesting. Larry has mentioned that very interesting response to that. But for me also, I think it's possible to try to work out the property rights in coexistence with the indigenous economies. But then the motivation for rights is one thing that we all need to be careful about. What is the motivation for property rights? And that motivation makes it it lays the real foundation for that property right without getting clear the motivation. Because in Africa now, of course, the agitations, how the property rights, the indigenous people who owns the land, and all these things that are going on there. But then when you think about the reasons behind those agitations, it becomes a little bit questionable for those who are making those agitations, and even the government trying to lay claim to the fact that they need to restructure the land. So if those motivations are right, I think they can coexist. Thank you.
I think that's a great point, and it actually ties into that the Letsuke story. When the motivations are right, these things can coexist together. And so I think there's a lot of hope within this. There might be a lot of criticisms of the ransom economy that we currently structurally live in, but I think both presenters, and I presented myself too, I think we talked about the fact that there is hope within this. There is hope for us to find ways to structurally move together, but it requires that undoing of the structural inequities that have existed and moving away from the ransom economy and moving toward an equitable framework where Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous rights are held at the same level, and where our values and who's benefiting and who's not benefiting are actually taken into real consideration. So I just want to thank you both for such wonderful presentations and such a wonderful discussion today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Diane, who's going to take us into our break and give us a little bit of housekeeping. So thank you so much, Masicho. Hi.
Thank you, Ariel. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Abiodun. That was an awesome panel. We had a really good understanding of how to shift our perspective on some of these things that maybe we've taken for granted in terms of the structuring of our economies. So thank you again for all of that knowledge. We're going to step into a break now, everyone. So please come back at the hour. So in Pacific time, that's 12 p.m., 3 p.m. Eastern, to hear from our next session on decolonizing data, centering Indigenous values in economics. It's going to be a really good one. Definitely come back for it. But for now, get up, get outside, get some food, get some water, do what you need. And also, reminder that we have working groups at the end of the day. If I could get the link in the chat for signing up for the working groups, we'd love to hear from you. You can come and connect with the panelists, with other people in the conference, and talk about some of these ideas. We'd love to have you in the working groups. You can also check out the Miro board if you want to take some collective notes or write down an idea that stuck with you. We'd love to hear what it is. If we get the 2 links in the chat, that'd be great. And other than that, we'll see you at the top of the hour. So thank you very much. Have a good break.